It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Happy 2019 to Christopher Dickey, foreign editor of the Daily Beast.
Another year, more stories.
Another year wiser?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, there's some blunt talk. We'll hear some blunt talk perhaps from Vivian Waltz, the Paris correspondent for Time magazine. How are you?
Good, very good. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Bonne année to Laure Mondeville, senior correspondent at French daily newspaper Le Figaro.
Bonne année, cher François.
Okay. And also author of Who is Donald Trump? Gregory Viscusi, reporter for Bloomberg News, who will tell us later about his New Year's resolutions. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. It's Friday. For many, that means payday. So spare a thought for the 800,000 U.S. federal workers laid off by what comes Saturday be the longest ever government shutdown. This week's theatrics have included a U.S. president who gives his first nationally televised speech from the Oval Office, travels to the Mexican border to score his point about funding for a $5.7 billion wall, and the storming out of a meeting with top Democratic lawmakers Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi.
Incredible. We're negotiating and having tremendous success with China. And I find China, frankly, in many ways, to be far more honorable than Brian, Chuck, and Nancy. I really do. I think that China is actually much easier to deal with than the opposition party.
China more honorable than crying Chuck and Nancy, Christopher Dickey.
Well, look, I've said it before, and I'd say it again. I mean, he basically is appealing to an audience that he thinks of as if it were a professional wrestling audience. That's why he gives people nicknames. He plays these games. This is all theater for him. This isn't policy. This is all theater about getting his base riled up, getting them afraid, getting them angry, getting them excited and cheering. That's why he was so incredibly mediocre in his Oval Office appearance, because he was just sitting in front of a camera trying to be presidential.
Let's play this game. Let's compare negotiating with China and negotiating with the Senate Minority Leader and the Speaker of the House.
How are you going to compare that? He's talking to two American politicians, and on the other hand, he's talking to a man in Xi Jinping who essentially is trying to reorient the world in a way that will benefit China enormously and essentially reestablish a Chinese empire. That's a little different than dealing with Crying Chuck and Nancy. But this is just his game. Look at these ridiculous pictures of him at the border. I mean, and not to mention Ted Cruz with a beard. I mean, it's ludicrous stuff.
Ludicrous stuff, or is it, Gregory Viscusi?
I think pretty ludicrous. I think this is probably the biggest miscalculation he's done so far in his term. That I think that generally you've got to credit him. He's got a certain political sense for his base, you know, how to play the game. And this time he seems to have blown it. I mean, the speech was lame. He is taking the blame for the shutdown. A lot of his base is hurting from this, you know, farmers who rely on loans and payments, you know, government workers, military people. And it doesn't seem, it's clear that some Republican senators are abandoning him over this. I think it is his first miscalculation.
Taking the blame, perhaps, overall. But what politics we've learned over the past couple of years is that what matters more is not convincing a majority of the people, but firing up your own base.
Are they fired up over this? I'm not sure.
I think they are, in a way, you know. I mean, I think at least, you know, Trump is saying, basically, he cannot give up on the wall. I've been saying that from the beginning, that the wall is what brought Trump to the presidency in terms of political symbolism. And I think he cannot give it up. And he's trying to demonstrate that, you know, he's actually just suggesting something pretty common sense, to build up a wall which actually already pretty much exists, you know, partly on this territory, and that the Democrats in the past have been had accepted, and that he just wants to build it up, you know, to complete and build something stronger. And so he's trying to make them look you know, irresponsible or weak or not taking care of security. He might lose this game, but at least he's showing that he's keeping his promise, and that's the same with China. And also, I think what is interesting, I think there is actually some kind of comparison to be made with what he's doing, with North Korea, with China, and with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. He's playing this huge theater. He's in a fight. It's a fight on the stage of politics. And he's going to go back and forth, to blow up, to have this, indeed, speech on TV, then come back, go on the border. And he's trying all these different levers and seeing what is going to happen. He might lose, but,
he's testing what might work. He's
testing what might work.
It's about more than the border wall, because we heard in his speech, for instance, when he made the argument that he talked about rich politicians who build walls around their properties. He didn't say rich people. He said rich politicians. So there is.
He knows a thing or two about that.
No, but he's taking on lawmakers. He's taking on the institution of Congress.
That is true. But the problem I think that he faces now is obviously it's about more. It's a lot more about the border wall than about the border wall, and always has been. And it's now about 2020 and who's going to win the elections next year. And he cannot afford to back down, and neither can the Democrats. So you have two sides, neither of which can afford to give an inch, because this is the opening salvo of the 2020 elections. And I think I agree with Greg that this is like a bad miscalculation, in the sense that you can appeal to your base, you can rile them up, you can have them fired up, but that base is narrow. And it's a hardline base, but it's a limited number, and it could shrink if the economy gets worse.
Are we blinded by precedent, which is 23 years ago, there was this big shutdown. It was the Republicans, led by the Speaker of the House then, Newt Gingrich, against then Democratic President Bill Clinton. And the losers were the Republicans in the court of public opinion. Are we blinded by that precedent? We think, whoever is thought to have provoked the shutdown automatically politically loses.
Well, maybe Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are old enough to remember it that way. But no, I think this is going to play out very much in terms of the present, not the past. This is not the precedent of the Clinton shutdown or the Gingrich shutdown. This is about right now. I think Laura's exactly right when she says he really needs this wall. But he's now in a negative with this. He can't do without the wall. That's the problem. It's not that he needs the wall to build support. It's that if he loses this fight about the wall, he will start to lose precisely those hardline constituents who say we can't do without it. We must have it.
But they will see that he fights. He's showing that he's a fighter, and I think he has the support of the majority of Americans.
But he can't be a loser.
Maybe not on the wall, but on the fact that a country without borders is not a country. And that's a very strong point that he has.
But no one doubts that.
That
Nobody
the border is important, and actually enforcing borders and enforcing laws. And on this particular element, he could actually win. He can also actually come up with with a big surprise proposition saying, okay, we cannot solve the thing on the wall only. Let's try to solve it on the big immigration plan, comprehensive type of reform. He can come back with that.
But he was offered that and he refused it.
He can come back and say, I'm ready for a big comprehensive immigration reform.
The Democrats
offered
him a compromise that he...
But he has suggested...
Nice looking at a worse one.
I know, but they didn't include the wall. So he can say, we can have a comprehensive reform, but let's include the wall.
Well, so he's edging toward that, but he's also edging toward a state of emergency, and that would truly be dangerous. Because if he declares a state of emergency, first of all, there is no emergency. There's no crisis at the border. He has completely created the crisis at the border.
But isn't that possibly how they get out of this? He declares a state of emergency. They open the government, and then the courts shoot him down and say, no, there's no emergency, you can't have it.
That's
and at that point,
everyone can say they stood their ground.
Everyone can say we stood our ground, and then he can blame the judges, and he can whatever.
He does that,
but he can show that he fought the fight. I think that's how they're going to get out of it.
Well, that may be a good solution, temporary solution for this problem, but if you set the precedent of declaring a state of emergency every time you want to get around Congress,
and then
with the idea that you'll play it that way,
the courts set the precedent that you can't do that.
Would you trust his courts?
I think I think any federal court would say no. I mean, you just have to read the 1976 statute on emergency. This does not apply. Any court would shoot it down.
His lawyers are telling him it does. It's what he says.
While the U.S. president takes on congressional Democrats, his Secretary of State returned to what Republican hawks see as the scene of the crime. Cairo, where in 2009 Barack Obama gave a speech to the Arab world signaling a break with the past on Iran, Iraq, and more. That was then. This is now.
Remember, it was here in this city, that another American stood before you. He told you that radical Islamist terrorism does not stem from an ideology. He told you that 9/11 led my country to abandon its ideals, particularly in the Middle East. He told you that the United States and the Muslim world needed, quote, a new beginning, end of quote. The results of these misjudgments have been dire. In falsely seeing ourselves as a force for what ails the Middle East, we were timid in asserting ourselves when the times and our partners demanded it.
Dire misjudgments, Christopher Dickey.
Look, this is a Saudi speech. That's what this is. He was speaking to an audience of Saudi clients, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and his government, and he was basically parroting the lines that we've heard from the Saudis again and again and again, that this is the big problem is Iran, only Iran, that Obama betrayed his friends. He completely ignored the invasion and occupation of Iraq as a factor in any of this, completely ignored it, and in fact said, you know, we only go in to liberate countries, and then when we get out when the job is done. Well, was the job done in Iraq? I don't think so. So the fact is, it was all a fiction built around the prejudices and interests of Mohammed bin Salman's Saudi Arabia. And the interesting thing about that speech is it took place 100 days exactly after the murder, dismemberment, and we presume the dissolving of the body of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Now, wasn't that something that might be mentioned in this context about rights, human rights, about freedom, about the press? Wasn't that something you might have touched on? Not Pompeo, and he wasn't going to go near it because this was essentially sucking up to Mohammed bin Salman.
It's a juggling act for Pompeo. On the one hand, stating that the enemy is Iran, and on the other hand, saying that the U.S. is withdrawing from northeast Syria, but remains committed to the region.
Yes, of course, and the whole notion that America never retreats, but here we are pulling out of Syria. So it seems like he has almost been trapped in a kind of web of contradictions. They're pulling out of Syria. Presumably that's going to be very good for Iran, and yet the Secretary of State is completely obsessed with Iran, as is the president. So I think that you saw it a little bit in that clip that we played before of him stumbling over his words, perhaps in a sense knowing that he's kind of entangled in a speech that doesn't really make any logical sense.
I think he's smarter than that speech, to tell you the truth.
I agree that he's quite smart, actually, Pompeo. What I would like to add, I think that Christopher is right about the part on Saudi Arabia, that actually, in a way, this administration had bet a lot on using Saudi Arabia to sort of play its game in the Middle East. But at the same time, I think we should nuance what we're seeing, because when we're saying that America is getting out of Syria, so it's out of the Middle East, it's not completely true. I mean, when Trump was in Iraq, I remind you that he was in Iraq over Christmas, visiting the troops and sort of thanking them, and that he said very clearly that they are staying in Iraq. So they're not completely withdrawing. They're going to have these bases, which will be in Iraq, and they have made clear in the last month, I would say, I mean, ever since he announced this withdrawal, that they would stand ready to strike, the Islamic State whenever they come. What I think that what Trump is actually raising one question that in some ways has to be addressed, which is when do you leave a country? I mean, the United States has no mandate to be in Syria, by the way. There is a government which is taking over, pushed by Putin, has actually reconquered the territory of Syria. So the question is, when do you withdraw? And of course, maybe it's in a way irresponsible, dangerous, because there's going to be a void. It's very problematic for Europe because we are next door, and for us, it's a huge problem that they're withdrawing. But at the same time, this question is being asked, I think, is right. And it's the same in Afghanistan. When do they get out? And it will be the same, for instance, in Sahel for the French. When do we get out? Do we stay forever?
I mean, this Pompeo speech was utterly incoherent and, contradictory and everything. Mm-hmm. However, let's be fair. The previous two American presidents did not cover themselves in glory in this region. Yes, Trump's made mistakes, I'm sure, but the previous two made probably bigger mistakes in a lot of ways.
And where does it go? Where does it go now? Because we had earlier in the week Trump's national security advisor coming off a trip to Israel where he says, we're not going to leave very soon to northeast Syria, and then getting rebuked by Turkey's president, who didn't even sit down with John Bolton.
I don't know where it's going to head. I mean, clearly, there's a fight going on within the administration. I don't, as we know, the president doesn't listen to his advisors. He's very, very unpredictable. So it's impossible to say where it's going to end. But it's clear there's not going to be an immediate pullout from Syria. I think that's pretty clear. They're starting to started. They already have started.
Yeah.
But will it be complete?
Well, it's not going to be that slow. I mean, in fact, they've got everything lined up to head out the door. I mean, they're pulling out. But it's going to happen.
Well, they didn't keep troops in bases in Iraq that
exactly.
they can destroy.
Yes, but the bases in Iraq, bases in Iraq are irrelevant to the ground war and the ground presence in Syria. That's the whole problem. The whole issue was that a big part of the issue was that under Obama, after 2014, he wanted to stay out of Syria. He didn't think it was a good idea to get into Syria. But when they realized they had to go into Syria, they had to have somebody to fight on the ground. The only people that they could find who were effective were the YPG, basically an adjunct of the PKK terrorist organization out of Turkey. Those people turned out to be very damned effective, and they were used again and again and again, and then a lot of them died, thousands of them died, and they killed thousands of people, including and especially thousands of people from ISIS. They retook Raqqa. They retook all that territory that they brag about retaking. Turkey wants to destroy that organization. The U.S. pulls out. Turkey will destroy that organization, and nothing that Pompeo says or Bolton says will protect it.
All right, we're gonna leave it there for now. We'll be right back. So stay with us. You're watching The World This Week.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there, on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.
$500,000 families evicted from their homes. 80% of construction firms bankrupt. Ghost towns. 30% unemployment. Public sector wages reduced and taxes increased. Spain, shortly after the economic crisis of 2008. Today, things look better, but what price has been paid?
We revisit Spain's economic crisis, all this week on France 24.
Welcome back. Before we resume the World This Week, it's just a reminder of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. Congo's Catholic Church asks the UN Security Council to pressure the National Electoral Commission to publish the breakdown of election returns. Its own tally does not match that announced, giving a provisional win to Felix Tshisekedi. The White House moves towards declaring a national emergency to fund Donald Trump's border wall. This as federal employees miss their first paycheck on a record-tying 20th day of a government shutdown. Canada's Prime Minister pleased to announce the offering of asylum to a Saudi teenager who fled fearing for her life. She's currently in Thailand. And a landmark vote in Macedonia's parliament, the passage of an amendment to the constitution that changes the country's name to the Republic of North Macedonia. It's a part of a deal to end a decades-long dispute with neighboring Greece. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. Welcome back as well to Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine. Laure Mondeville of French broadsheet Le Figaro. And Gregory Viscusi of the Bloomberg News Agency. What's the deal with Congo's very surprising election results? Supporters of provisional winner Felix Tshisekedi feting what's to be the first ever peaceful transition through the ballot box since independence in 1960. But in a vote that's 2 years overdue, with a provisional result announced at 2 in the morning, questions abound. What's the breakdown by region? What happens to the 1.7 million ballots never cast because the vote was postponed, in parts due to violence and Ebola in places? Why is the party of the outgoing president so eager, it seems, to accept that its candidate finished a distant third? And why doesn't the announced result match that of the 40,000 church observers who monitored the December 30th vote?
From the analysis this mission observed, we have noted that the results of the presidential elections published by the CENI do not correspond to the data our observation mission collected from the polling stations.
You hear that applause, Vivian Walt, and those bishops going one further this Friday in a video conference with the United Nations Security Council, urging the UN to pressure the Electoral Commission to give its election returns. What are the chances of that happening?
I think slim. I mean, here's a country who in nearly 60 years has not had a peaceful transition of power. You've had 2 presidents assassinated. There's been, violent overthrow of one of them. And you've had a leader who has been in power for, nearly 20 years and who succeeded his father. So the whole likelihood of a peaceful democratic transition is, I think, highly optimistic.
So what should what do you do? The election was flawed. We knew it would be flawed before. We talked about it here. You had to have an election, though.
Well, I think if they can put a lid on the kind of, say, popular uprising that might occur in response, this might come to be seen as kind of the best possible outcome in a very messy and conflict-ridden country. I mean, that's the cynical conclusion, I think, that a lot of people would draw. And
is there a deal between Tshisekedi, whose father was the longtime opposition stalwart, and the party of outgoing President Joseph Kabila?
Oh, it seems, well, firstly, I think it seems likely that Tshisekedi did not want to fold his support in with the real opposition to Kabila because it would leave him kind of nowhere. He wanted to be, an important guy of his own, like his father was, and so he broke away and wanted to start his own, opposition party. But I think that in doing so, yes, there possibly was some kind of backdoor deal with Kabila. We don't know what that is. Likely, given Congo and given Kabila, it involves money, I would think, assets. Kabila is said to have enormous assets personally, and it's in a country with just vast, vast resources.
All right, the other opposition candidate, Martin Fayulu, staging a press conference this Friday. He's going to contest the result. He claims he won with 61% of the vote. Many were surprised that the French foreign minister jumped into the fray so quickly, just hours after that overnight result announcement on Thursday.
First of all, I think we should all keep our cool and avoid clashes, and that clarity must emerge from these results, which contradict those which we expected,
Because things could turn sour?
Because things could turn sour, and because it would have appeared that Mr. Fayulu had emerged from these elections as the leader.
Mr. Fayulu, that wasn't the question that was put to him, and yet there he is saying it. Your thoughts on that?
That's quite interesting. I think that I mean, I have no particular thought myself, but I was reading the articles that our special envoy from Le Figaro was writing today, and he was underlying the fact that apparently this Martin Fayulu had won, came first with a big difference, in votes according to, certain polling, and that the other ones were really under 20%. So that means that's maybe why, the French didn't want to be tainted with some kind of, lies about what was going on. Remember this sort of new approach to what is going on. But what I was also reading, which was interesting, is apparently that Kabila had chosen to make a deal with this Felix Tshisekedi, probably because two of his major players from Congo were actually sort of supporting Fayulu, and he didn't like that because it would mean, being sort of really expelled from power.
On Le Drian's comments, when you're a diplomat, is it a good idea to tell the truth?
Well, if that is the truth, I think it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea to make the statement he made. It's a very bad idea because, especially with France, although it's not the former colonial power in Congo, it is part of Francophonie. It is part of the general French sphere. And I think that Le Drian making a statement like that is probably very ill-considered. But maybe he was just wasn't wide awake when he was talking.
It was in the morning. Here in France, the word of the week is crowdfunding. After last weekend's viral video of a former prizefighter punching gendarmes on a Paris bridge, there was outrage over the video and outrage over the 118,000 euros raised in less than 24 hours to pay the legal fees of Christophe Détinger, the former French light heavyweight champ, an instant folk hero to yellow vests on social media. The support and the sum stirring outrage elsewhere, and the crowdfunding site Litchi closing the account. Now, before turning himself in, the boxer posted a video on YouTube where he defended himself.
I was tear gassed on the last day. Yes, I wanted to advance on the riot police, but I was gassed with my friend and my wife. I was gassed, and for a moment the anger came up in me and I reacted badly. Yeah, I reacted badly, but I was defending myself.
J'ai senti que c'était quelqu'un qui savait ce qu'il faisait parce que les coups,
I felt it was someone who knew what he was doing because he kept coming back, protecting his face, and the hits were extremely well landed on my face. It was very long. The videos are short, but it lasted a very long time when you're trying to stay calm. We tried to stay back. We have no aggression towards them. But here it's just violence for the sake of violence.
Et voilà, c'est la violence gratuite.
And that's the testimony of one of the two gendarmes who was punched by this former French boxing champion.
I mean, the guy really has his good combination, right, left. He clearly hasn't lost his touch as a boxer.
Your thought on this whole, because it was competing crowdfundings. Now there's crowdfunding for the police.
There's crowdfunding to raise money for the police. I just shows that this movement's all over the place. I mean, I've spent quite a bit of time out of the demonstrations, breathed a fair amount of tear gas, and I've just met all sorts of people with all sorts of demands. People from all walks of life, with from right to left. Some very pleasant, some rather nasty, and with all sorts of demands. Many of them that can't be reconciled.
I do agree. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time too in the streets, trying to understand what was going on. I think this movement is actually very reflective of the diversity of this country. But what I find very worrying is that I think we are in a very bad place in France now, because we have on the one hand this movement, social movement, which has a big authenticity on the one hand. At the same time, it has been sort of taken up by very violent segments and elements and people sort of in rage and ready to sort of go against the institutions, go against, using violence for the sake of violence. That's very dangerous, going against the police in a way which is outrageous. And then we have an elite which is sort of, as a journalist from Le Figaro wrote today, Jacques de Saint-Victor, in a very interesting piece about history, is sort of taking the mantle of order, as you know, the power did in the 19th century during the 1830s, and it didn't end well, because they sort of locked themselves in the idea that they were representing the voice of reason, and that the people were totally going mad. And I think we have all these elements.
Well, it ended better for General de Gaulle in 1968. He organized a snap general election, which he won by a landslide, saying, look at all the disorder of the student demonstrations. Vote for me.
And that's true. And in a way, you know, that's some people are arguing that maybe it's not very understandable that you know the government isn't going for some kind of elections actually to sort of turn this huge movement of discontent into something more political. But I think we are really in a pre-revolutionary moment, and we are in a bad place because there are all these conspiracy theories, a total lack of trust, and this sort of, you know, banging together of these different forces. On the one hand, you know, government, the other hand, the street, and the violent people in between.
So the big announcement is made on Wednesday that there's the start of these public hearings, the so-called grand debate here in France, to sort of channel all the various demands of the people in this leaderless movement. Where's it going, Vivian?
I mean, I hope that works, but to me it seems a little bit tone deaf, if you like. And I think Laura put her finger right on something, which is the elite, the anti-elite versus the elite. And the fact that the elite in France is in a way cocooned in a sort of environment of order and comfort and splendor. And it doesn't matter what kind of ideology there is on the other side. There's, as Greg says, left, right, and everything in between. There's a kind of revolt against what is seen to be a tiny talking class. And the idea of a grand debate just seems to kind of perpetuate that, in my mind.
Let's turn this on its head for a minute. We keep talking about this as a vast social movement. I don't see any indication that it is a vast social movement. The thing that's driving those pictures, the reason we're talking about this, is violence. That's why we're talking about it. Violence is what keeps this in the headlines. Violence is what makes us talk about it. And if it were a vast social movement, then we would see millions of people in the streets. Have you seen millions of people in the streets? You have not. Nobody has seen millions of people in the streets. We see little groups of people at roundabouts around the country. We see lots of people destroying radars around the country.
Yeah, speed traps. 60% of the
60% of the speed traps have been blown away. Fine, that's great. That's kind of amusing. That still doesn't reflect huge numbers. We don't see the huge numbers. And when you look at the polls, commonly cited polls tell you constantly 60%, 70% approval for the Gilet Jaunes. Approval of what? What, if you look at the question, it's approval of the mobilization of the Gilet Jaunes. What the hell does that mean?
That means that there is a huge discontent. I disagree with you, frankly, on that, because that shows there is a huge discontent in this country.
Well, discontent.
And that this government actually has a very narrow. No. There is a narrow. I mean, what we've been seeing for weeks now shows that we are in a very serious political moment.
I think we're in a serious political moment because it's being handled very badly by...
It's not just a few people. I disagree.
Because there's a vacuum. Macron's party is not a real party, and the two establishment parties have vanished. And that's the danger.
Yeah.
Thankfully, we don't have elections till 2022, and something could emerge in the next 3 years. But that's the danger, that there's no other offer.
And we're going to see...
There's no other political
So the blowing away of the mainstream center-right and center-left blocks.
We do have EU elections.
Well, you have EU elections.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say that.
Which I'm sure we'll get to later.
And that's going to be a moment of truth for actually Macron. And I think he's really in a bad situation.
But Christopher's right about the numbers. I mean, the absolute peak of the demonstrations, it was only one weekend, there were 300,000. After that, the numbers fell. 300,000 nationwide in France is not that much. I mean, there's been plenty of movements in the past 10, 20 years that have put millions into the streets with no effect.
Yes,
because they weren't violent.
But the nature of the movement, first of all, the sort of diversity of the people who came, for instance, on these crossroads, all over France. I mean, in small cities, in little villages, in big cities, and very different people who don't actually go into the street to hold, slogans. People like, plumbers and electricians, hardworking people, business people, small business, etc. The people were really faces of France, and I think we should not disregard that and think that it's nothing. I think it's extremely serious, actually. The problem is it has been hijacked by you're right here, Christopher, by extremely dangerous,
I get tear gassed every goddamn Saturday. I go out and get tear gassed, and what do I see? I see basically casseurs, people breaking things, smashing things, burning things, and these decent people that you talk about, there are some of them. You can tell they all look completely lost in the big city, and they're standing there as spectators to this. They're not going and saying, this is ruining our cause, violence is bad for us. They love to see Paris.
Say that.
They don't say it to the people who are doing it, and the people who are doing it are there to trash Paris.
All right, the Yellow Vest getting a major endorsement from across the Alps. Italy's Deputy Prime Minister Luigi Di Maio urging them on his blog to, quote, hang tough. The leader of his coalition, of the coalition partner from the far-right League Party, going one better, calling for Emmanuel Macron to resign.
I give all possible support to the French, who in a well-behaved and respectful way tell their president, who does not think in the interests of the French people, that the sooner he returns home, the better. But any episode of violence is to be condemned, without conditions. Condemned.
Gregory Viscusi?
This is all about the European elections, is really what it is. It's all about the European elections, that both Di Maio and Salvini are going to be competing against each other in these European elections, and they both need allies.
But can you think of a precedent of an Italian deputy prime minister cheering on the people who are calling for the resignation of France's president?
The president of France called them lepers. He called them lepers.
That's right.
He made it very clear before the election who he wanted to win. I mean, this idea that, oh my God, how could you possibly interfere in the politics of another country? First of all, the French do it all the time. Second of all, they should. If you're going to have a European Union, if it's going to be a union, you have every right to talk about politics in other countries, just as a governor of New York can talk about what's happening in California. I mean, why not?
I think that Macron has delivered a fair amount of hits against Salvini. And Salvini
and rightly so.
Wants to be bigger than just the deputy prime minister of Italy, which doesn't sound that impressive. He wants to be the big man in Europe, the big populist in Europe. And that's the way he's positioning himself. The elections, the EU elections, are just 4 months away.
But the backstory to this is the competition between Di Maio and Salvini. I mean, that's what the backstory to this is.
But I think Susan is right to say that, the big match, though, is going to be between the Macron camp and the Salvini one. And Salvini, actually, after people thought it was going to be Orban, it was going to be Kurz, now it seems like, it's going to be Salvini, like the emerging leader of this sort of a pro-nation state type of Europe.
He goes this week to Warsaw to get the support of the nationalist Peace Party of Kaczynski.
Absolutely. Not sure that he will get all the support, because these people, of course, what is going to be tough for them is that they disagree on some very important issues.
On almost everything.
For instance, the Russia, of course, is a big disagreement because Salvini is quite pro-Russian, and the Poles, of course, are very reluctant, to give a pass to Moscow. And also they disagree on how to deal with migration.
And they disagree on money. Italy is a big net payer into the EU, and Poland's the biggest net receiver from the EU. So, I mean, there's all sorts of issues where they don't have agreement.
Yes, but they are going to push this sort of, sovereignist type of Europe against Macron. And Macron is in such a bad place, internally, that he's going to be very weakened.
This week's sign that the apocalypse is upon us comes courtesy of Vivian Walt. You went to Sweden's second city, Gothenburg, and met 38-year-old Johan Österlund, the boss of Biohacks International. Now, most biochipping research targets people with medical conditions. Not so here, Vivian. He's got people putting chips under their skins so that they don't have to carry credit cards or their gym membership card around.
The Swedes love it.
4,000 people have done it so far.
Actually, I think 4,000 is now an outdated figure. There are thousands every day. In fact, he just
Does it worry you?
texted me today saying he was overwhelmed with requests. Does it worry me? It's a little creepy, I have to say, to watch people getting chips put into their bodies. Then again, you ask them, they say, well, what are you carrying around a cell phone for? You know, that's like transmitting your whereabouts every second of the day and night, and it's way less secure.
How big are they? How big are these things?
It's like a grain of rice.
And how far does it transmit? I mean, how far can you be picked up?
Yeah, it's what's called near-field communication. So you could, say, operate this microphone with your hand.
So it does allow you to be tracked
it,
less than carrying your cell phone around.
Pay for things.
Are you convinced, Chris, for
credit cards?
Well, I read Viv's article. I thought it was great, and I'm not gonna get it done like tomorrow, but I think it certainly the people that she was interviewing make a pretty good case for it. It's not just about not carrying your credit cards. It's about not carrying your keys. It's about having basically a means of electronic identification that we're using phones, credit cards, other things for. That's built into your hand. Usually they put it right about here, don't they?
That's right.
So, it seems to me...
Lol's shaking her head. Lol's shaking her head.
I'm going to play the conservative voice here because I think that, you know, it's really part of this crazy world where technology seems to be taking over, and man so wants to be able to do everything that he's sort of getting enlarged by technology, but he's forgetting that he's not God and that he's only man. And I think that's one of the key problems, you know, of our time, that we are controlling less and less things, but we want more and more to look like gods.
But when you're in passport line, don't you choose the option of just doing your fingerprint and skipping the big line? I do.
All right.
Yeah, but
Greg's convinced. Many thanks.
I don't know if
Gregory Viscusi, sign him up. Many thanks, Greg. I want to thank Vivian
what's wrong
Wald.
with just eye recognition of fingerprints?
I don't want to be traced everywhere.
I want to thank Christopher Dickey. I want to thank as well Laure Mondeville. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.
But you already are, Laura.
You are yourself.